He didn't die famous. He didn't die surrounded by cameras, applause, or tributes. He died alone. And according to the youngest daughter who has finally broken her silence, he knew it was coming. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the final moments of a Hollywood legend weren't dramatic in the way movies portray them, but desperate, confused, and filled with regret? What if the last thing he did wasn't say goodbye, but beg for help? That's the version of events no one wanted to hear. For days after the deaths, headlines focused on the spectacle, the money, the mansion, the shock. A legendary figure found dead inside a pristine estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. Security gates, ghost houses, distance between bedrooms, distance between people. It looked safe. It looked untouchable. But safety, as it turns out, is often just an illusion dressed in luxury. Because behind those gates was a family that hadn't spoken honestly in years. A father who had spent his life directing stories, but had lost control of his own. A daughter who ignored a call she thought she could return later. And a moment that would split her life into two parts, before the phone rang, and after she realized it was too late. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about silence. And the price of waiting. In the early hours of that Sunday, the house didn't scream. It didn't shatter. It didn't explode into chaos the way you'd expect when something unthinkable happens. Instead, it did something far more unsettling. It stayed quiet. No alarms. No frantic neighbors. No dramatic interruption to the calm of a wealthy neighborhood that had grown accustomed to believing tragedy happened elsewhere. Inside, time moved differently. Somewhere within those walls, a man who had once commanded sets, studios, and rooms full of powerful people was reduced to something painfully human. Afraid, injured, alone. And according to his youngest daughter, he reached out. She says he called her. Once. Maybe more. And when the call went unanswered, he didn't call again. That detail alone changes everything, doesn't it? Because it forces an uncomfortable question. If someone you love called you late at night, would you answer? Or would you assume there would be time tomorrow? Romy was used to tomorrow. Tomorrow was where hard conversations lived. Tomorrow was where apologies waited. Tomorrow was where distance felt manageable. She had learned, like so many children of powerful parents, how to love from afar, how to keep emotional space without calling it abandonment, how to convince yourself that silence is the same thing as peace. Until it isn't. When the news broke, it didn't come gently. It came crashing through phones, screens, and whispers. A double death. A luxury estate turned crime scene. A family shattered overnight. But Romy didn't learn the truth from a headline. She learned it from a detail that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The timeline. Something about it felt wrong. Too clean. Too fast. Too convenient. She replayed the last days in her head. Conversations she almost had. Messages she left on read. The call she didn't pick up because she was tired, or busy, or convinced it wasn't urgent. How many times have we all made that same choice? She told herself it was nothing. That if it had been serious, he would have called again. That he'd survived bigger things than whatever stress he was under that week. After all, he was strong, resilient, untouchable. That's what legends are, right? Untouchable. But legends age. They weaken. They lose allies. And sometimes, they lose the one thing they never thought they'd need. Help. What makes this story different isn't just the violence. It's not the investigation. It's not even the arrest that would follow. It's the realization that the most important moment didn't happen when authorities arrived. It happened earlier, when a phone rang, and when unanswered. Romy has said she lives inside that moment now, not as a memory, but as a place, a loop she can't escape. She wonders what his voice sounded like. Calm, panicked, apologetic, angry. Did he know he was running out of time? Or did he believe, like she did, that there would be another chance to talk? Here's the contradiction no one talks about. Families with money often have the most distance. Big houses make it easier to avoid each other. Success creates schedules that don't align. Power teaches people to suppress vulnerability because they're used to being needed, not needing. In this family, independence was praised. Strength was expected. Silence was mistaken for stability. And over time, that silence grew teeth. There were warning signs. Romy admits that now. Moments that felt off, but didn't feel urgent enough to confront. A heaviness in her father's voice. A sharpness in conversations that used to be warm. The sense that something was unraveling behind the scenes, even as the public image remained polished. But acknowledging those signs would have required action, and action would have required proximity. It's easier to love people when you don't have to confront their pain up close, isn't it? When authorities later described the scene, the public focused on numbers, on damage, on shock value. But Romy couldn't hear any of that. All she could think about was the space between the rooms, the distance from the guest house, the fact that people were nearby and still so far away. That's the part that haunts her. Not just that he died, but that he died reachable. Because he didn't disappear. He didn't vanish. He was there, calling, waiting, hoping, and she wasn't. When Romy finally spoke publicly, her words weren't polished. They weren't strategic. They weren't designed to control a narrative. They sounded like something else entirely. Confession. She talked about unimaginable pain, about a loss that didn't feel real, about how grief doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in through ordinary moments. A phone vibrating, a quiet house, a missed call notification that can never be answered. And then she said something that made people stop scrolling. She said he begged her for help. Not demanded, not ordered, begged. That single word stripped away decades of power, reputation, and authority. It reframed him not as a titan, but as a father reaching out to his child because he didn't know who else to turn to. And suddenly, the story wasn't about what happened inside the house. It was about what didn't happen outside of it. The call that wasn't answered, the door that wasn't opened, the assumption that time was on their side. Romy doesn't ask for forgiveness. She doesn't dramatize her pain. She simply states the truth as she understands it now. That waiting felt harmless until it became irreversible. That realization is unbearable because it forces a question none of us want to face. Who have you been meaning to call? Who do you assume will always be there when you're ready? We like to believe tragedy announces itself, that it sends warnings loud enough to interrupt our routines, that we'll know when something is truly urgent. But sometimes urgency whispers. Sometimes it sounds like a tired voice on the other end of a phone. Sometimes it rings once, and if you don't answer, it never rings again. As the investigation unfolded, as rumors spread, as narratives hardened into certainty, Romy's grief existed in a different dimension. While the world argued about what happened, she was stuck on what didn't. She wasn't thinking about blame yet. She was thinking about timing, about how close she was to changing everything, and how easily she missed it. Because what came next wouldn't just expose what happened that night. It would reveal what had been breaking long before anyone noticed. And once that truth surfaced, there would be no way to look at this family the same way again. But before any of that came out, before the arrests, before the headlines, before the explanations, there was still one unanswered question hanging in the air. Why did he feel so alone that night, in a house full of people? And when we finally understand that, everything else will fall into place. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The house didn't announce what was coming. No alarms blared. No glass shattered. No neighbors rushed outside in panic. If you had driven past that estate that night, you would have seen the same thing you'd always seen. Warm lights glowing behind tall hedges, a long driveway disappearing into darkness, and the quiet confidence of wealth that makes everything look controlled. But control was already gone. Something had shifted hours earlier, and no one noticed. That's the most unsettling part. The night unfolded the way so many nights do in homes like this. Slow, uneventful, deceptively calm. The kind of calm that makes people assume nothing could possibly be wrong. Dinner had ended. Doors were closed. Distance did the rest. Big houses are strange that way. They absorb sound. They stretch time. They allow people to exist near each other without ever truly being together. Inside those walls, multiple lives were running on different schedules, different emotional clocks, different realities. And somewhere between them, a man was unraveling. What do you imagine the last hours of a powerful figure look like? Most people picture defiance, or dignity, or a dramatic confrontation that feels cinematic. But real life doesn't work like that. Real life is quieter, more confusing, more ordinary. That night wasn't defined by shouting. It was defined by pauses. Long pauses, hesitations, moments where someone considered saying something and didn't. Earlier in the evening, there had been tension. Not explosive, not theatrical. The kind that lives under the surface, where every word feels slightly sharper than it should. The kind you can dismiss if you're used to living with discomfort. That tension had been there for months. Years, if you asked the people who really knew the family. But on this particular night, something was different. There was an edge to it. A sense that whatever was being held back was close to spilling over. And still, no one intervened. No one knocked on a door to check in. No one asked the question that might have changed the trajectory of everything. Are you okay? As the hours passed, the house grew quieter. Lights clicked off one by one. The kind of silence that usually signals rest. But this wasn't rest. This was isolation settling in. The guest house sat at a distance, separated just enough to give the illusion of independence. It had always been framed as a convenience. A way for everyone to have space. A way to avoid conflict by pretending it didn't exist. Space, in this family, was a solution to everything. Except it wasn't. As midnight approached, the main house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that feels heavy if you're paying attention. Inside one of the rooms, the man at the center of this story was awake. Not sleeping. Waiting. Waiting for what? Exactly, is something only he knew. Maybe he was waiting for the phone to ring back. Maybe he was waiting for the courage to make another call. Maybe he was waiting for morning, believing, like so many of us do, that whatever feels unbearable at night will somehow be manageable in daylight. But the night has a way of amplifying fear. Every doubt sounds louder. Every regret feels heavier. Every mistake replays itself with cruel clarity. And regret was everywhere. He thought about conversations that never happened. Apologies that felt overdue. The way authority had replaced intimacy in his relationships. The way people listened to him, but didn't necessarily hear him anymore. Power isolates you like that. It convinces you that you don't need help until the moment you do. At some point, he picked up the phone. That matters. Because picking up the phone is an admission. It's a crack in the armor. It's the moment someone stops pretending they have everything under control. He didn't call a colleague. He didn't call security. He didn't call a lawyer. He called his daughter. The youngest one. The one he worried about. The one he didn't want to burden. The one he hoped would understand without needing an explanation. The call didn't last long. In fact, it didn't last at all. It went unanswered. And in that unanswered ring, something inside him collapsed. People love to speculate about what someone should have done next. As if fear follows logic. As if panic consults a checklist. As if pain waits patiently while you figure out the best course of action. That's not how desperation works. Desperation narrows your world. It shrinks your options until the one thing you thought would be there isn't. After that call, the timeline becomes murky. That's not an accident. What happens next isn't loud. It isn't clean. It isn't something anyone inside the house would later remember clearly. And that uncertainty would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because when investigators began piecing together the night, they found gaps. Minutes that didn't add up. Movements that didn't make sense. A silence that felt deliberate. The house didn't show signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No alarms triggered. No frantic attempts to escape. That detail alone would spark endless debate. How could something so violent happen without alerting anyone else? The answer lies in familiarity. When danger comes from outside, people react. When it comes from inside, they hesitate. They rationalize. They wait. Waiting is what this family did best. As the night deepened, something shifted irreversibly. Whatever fragile balance had existed snapped under the weight of unresolved anger and unspoken grievances. And still, the house remained quiet. No one came running. No one called for help. No one imagined that by morning, everything would be different. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come until hours later. When light returned, morning has a way of exposing what darkness hides. Shadows retreat. Details sharpen. Silence becomes suspicious instead of soothing. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of scene people imagine from movies. It was slow, confusing, devastating in a way that doesn't hit all at once. And by the time authorities arrived, the night had already taken its secrets with it. What they found raised more questions than answers. Not just about what happened, but about what didn't. Because as they walked through the house, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't sudden. This was the final chapter of something that had been building for a long time. And as the investigation began, another realization surfaced. One that would haunt the daughter who never answered the phone. Her father hadn't just been alone when he died. He had been surrounded by people who never heard him. But the silence inside that house wasn't accidental. And once investigators started looking closely at who was there that night and who wasn't, the story would take a turn no one was prepared for. Because the next question wasn't about what happened inside the main house. It was about what was happening just steps away in the guest house, and who was watching the night unfold from there. But what came next would shift suspicion in a direction that would shock even those closest to the family. And nothing would ever look the same again. From the outside, this family looked untouchable. That's the word people kept using. Untouchable. As if success had wrapped itself around them like armor. As if money, reputation, and legacy could somehow insulate a household from the same fractures that break every other family in the world. But perfection is often just distance, carefully curated. And distance was this family's specialty. If you had asked anyone who knew them casually, they would have described a powerful patriarch, a devoted partner, accomplished children, and a home that symbolized everything a successful life was supposed to be. Holiday photos, polite smiles, public appearances that suggested harmony without ever proving it. What people didn't see was how little time they spent in the same emotional room. Because behind the image was a family that communicated through schedules instead of conversations, through assistance instead of honesty, through silence instead of conflict. And that silence had been growing louder for years. The father at the center of this story built his career telling other people's stories. He understood tension, pacing, emotional payoff. He knew exactly how to make an audience feel something. But inside his own house, he avoided the hardest scenes. Instead of confrontation, there was avoidance. Instead of resolution, there was postponement. Instead of saying what needed to be said, there was always the assumption that things would work themselves out eventually. They rarely do. The children learned early that love in this family came with conditions. Not cruel ones, not obvious ones, but subtle expectations. Strength, independence, self-sufficiency. Needing too much was discouraged. So they learned not to need. That sounds healthy on paper. In reality, it creates emotional ghosts. Each child adapted differently. One became distant. One became defiant. One tried to disappear into normalcy. And the youngest, the one who would later break everyone's hearts, became the observer. Romy watched more than she spoke. She noticed tone shifts, body language, the way conversations ended abruptly when someone walked into the room. She learned which topics were safe and which ones shut everything down. Over time, she internalized an unspoken rule: don't make things harder. That rule followed her into adulthood. As her father aged, his authority remained intact, but something else began to erode. His certainty, his patience, his sense of control. A man who had spent decades shaping outcomes was suddenly confronting a reality he couldn't edit. Family doesn't follow scripts. Children grow up. Power shifts. And the traits that once built success, command, decisiveness, control, can become liabilities when tenderness is required. That transition didn't come easily to him. He still wanted to be respected. Still wanted to be the one with answers. Still wanted to be needed, but on his terms. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the emotional gap widened. The house got bigger. The conversations got shorter. The visits became less frequent. Everyone told themselves this was normal. Successful families are busy. Adult children have lives. Space is healthy, isn't it? But there's a difference between space and absence. And this family crossed that line without realizing it. Holidays became performances. Dinners were polite, efficient, surface level. There was laughter, but it felt rehearsed. There were questions, but none that risked discomfort. No one wanted to be the one who disrupted the fragile equilibrium. Because disruption meant vulnerability. And vulnerability had never been rewarded here. The son who lived on the property was often described as the closest physically, but emotionally, that was complicated. Proximity doesn't equal intimacy. Sometimes it intensifies resentment. Being near power without possessing it creates friction. Old grievances lingered. Expectations went unmet. Conversations ended in frustration rather than understanding. And still, no one intervened. No family meeting. No honest reckoning. Just time passing. Romy, watching from a distance, sensed the imbalance. She felt it when calls felt shorter than they used to. When her father sounded distracted, irritable, tired. She wondered if she should say something. Then she told herself she was overthinking. That's how avoidance survives. You convince yourself that discomfort is imaginary, that if something were really wrong, it would announce itself more clearly. But emotional collapse rarely comes with warning sirens. It creeps in quietly. There were moments, small ones, that felt like missed opportunities in hindsight. A dinner that ended early. A conversation that veered away from something important. A joke that landed too close to the truth and was quickly brushed aside. Those moments didn't seem significant at the time. They do now. Because when everything finally shattered, people would look back and say the signs were always there. They just didn't want to see them. The public never suspected a thing. Why would they? The image held. Awards were celebrated. Appearances were made. Smiles were captured. No one looks closely at a family that appears to have everything. Especially not one that has mastered the art of privacy. That privacy became another shield. Problems stayed internal. Pain stayed unspoken. And when pain stays unspoken long enough, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. By the time the night of the tragedy arrived, this family was living parallel lives under the same roof. Close enough to hear doors close. Too far apart to hear what mattered. And here's the cruel irony. They thought distance was keeping the peace. In reality, it was building the conditions for disaster. Romy would later admit that she sensed something breaking, but didn't know where she fit into fixing it. She didn't feel like it was her place to intervene. She didn't want to overstep. She didn't want to make things worse. So she waited, just like everyone else. That waiting would become the most devastating choice of her life. Because families don't implode in a single night. They erode. They weaken at the seams. They learn how to function without addressing what hurts. And when the breaking point finally comes, it feels sudden only because no one was paying attention. As investigators would later piece together the family dynamics, one question kept resurfacing. How could people so close miss something so serious? The answer is uncomfortable. They didn't miss it. They minimized it. They explained it away. They trusted appearances over instincts. And now, the appearance was gone. All that remained were the fractures. And one person who had been living on the property, close enough to feel every tremor, would soon become the center of a storm no one could have predicted. Because while the rest of the family kept their distance, one child never really left. And that closeness, instead of bringing comfort, would expose something far darker. But before suspicion could settle, before accusations could form, before the narrative could shift, one reality had to be confronted. This family wasn't undone by one act. It was undone by years of silence. And the next chapter would reveal how that silence concentrated itself in one place, in one person. Because the child who stayed behind wasn't just a footnote in this story. He was about to become its most troubling figure. And once his role came into focus, everything people thought they understood about that night would begin to unravel. But what came next would force everyone to reconsider whether proximity is a form of love or a breeding ground for resentment that's been waiting for the right moment to explode. He had always lived in the shadow of the family's success. Not literally. Physically, he was never far from the main house. But emotionally, he existed in a liminal space, close enough to witness authority, far enough to remain untouchable. The child who stayed behind had a complicated relationship with proximity. He understood the value of being nearby, but he had also learned early that distance could be a shield. He moved into the guest house years earlier, ostensibly for independence. But the truth was subtler. Staying nearby allowed him to observe, to measure, to absorb the rhythms of the household without being fully enmeshed. He could participate, or choose not to. He could intervene, or wait. And the boundaries of that choice were murky, often defined more by opportunity than by intent. On that fateful night, his proximity would become a defining factor in everything that followed. What people often misunderstand about families like this is that closeness does not guarantee connection. A mansion, no matter how expansive, cannot manufacture intimacy. Shared walls and hallways can exist alongside profound isolation. And the child who stayed behind understood that better than anyone. He had noticed the tensions growing, the quiet warnings that signaled something was wrong. The father's subtle irritations, the mother's furrowed brow, the daughter's hesitations. He had seen small fractures that the rest of the family either ignored or rationalized away. But he never acted. Not yet. He had his reasons. Some practical, some personal, some difficult to articulate even to himself. In families with wealth and fame, the rules of engagement are different. Actions are weighted by consequences that extend beyond the immediate. A misstep could have legal implications, social fallout, or public scrutiny. So inaction often seems safer than intervention. Observation becomes the default strategy. And waiting is easier when consequences feel inevitable or when the outcome seems predetermined. That night, he followed the pattern he had perfected over years, observing without acting, watching without speaking, listening without interjecting. But the rules of his world were about to be rewritten. Earlier in the evening, subtle signs indicated that tension might reach a breaking point. Conversations ended abruptly. The father's tone sharpened unexpectedly. A minor disagreement revealed underlying frustrations that had been simmering quietly for months. The child in the guest house could feel it. Everyone could feel it. Yet the magnitude of what was coming remained unperceived until it was too late. The father, seasoned in controlling narratives and outcomes, did not act like a man prepared to die. He acted like a man hoping to be heard one last time. And he chose the child he trusted most. Or perhaps, the one he believed would respond without judgment. That choice alone says something profound about the dynamics of this family. Love intertwined with expectation, hope tethered to proximity. The call came. A single ring that carried more significance than words can fully convey. The father reached out, seeking connection, seeking help, seeking an acknowledgement that might stave off catastrophe. The child in the guest house did not answer. There were reasons, justifications, distractions, but in the aftermath, they would matter little. Because one unanswered call can alter the trajectory of everything. Moments later, time moved differently inside the estate. Silence thickened. Hallways that had always felt safe became corridors of dread. The weight of anticipation settled across rooms and floors, unnoticed by those who could not perceive urgency or unwilling to confront it. From the guest house, he could hear snippets of movement, conversations, laughter, but none that penetrated the unfolding tragedy. And yet, his physical proximity was a stark contradiction. He was close enough to intervene, close enough to hear, close enough to matter, but emotionally, he was distant. That distance would become one of the defining paradoxes of this night. Because proximity without engagement is a strange space. You are part of events, yet separate from them. You can witness without influencing. You can see, yet remain unseen. And that separation creates tension, a quiet torment that lingers far longer than any loud confrontation. The child who stayed behind knew this. He had lived within these boundaries for years, mastering the art of selective engagement. He had learned how to appear involved while remaining insulated, how to measure actions for personal safety, how to calculate responses in a world where a misstep could have repercussions far beyond the immediate. But on that night, mastery failed him. The variables were beyond calculation. Emotions outweighed logic. Proximity turned into pressure. Observation became a form of silent accusation. And the walls of the guest house that had long offered him security now underscored his isolation in a different sense, morally and psychologically. As the night stretched, subtle indicators suggested urgency, but none were definitive. Nothing screamed for action in the conventional sense. And yet, an internal tension began to accumulate. Every sound from the main house, every pause in conversation, every movement of doors or curtains intensified the psychological strain. Observation became an act of watching a domino fall and knowing you might have prevented it, yet feeling powerless to act. That is the paradox of human behavior in crisis. The closer you are to the event, the more responsibility you feel, and the more paralyzed you can become. Familiarity dulls urgency. Comfort delays response. And anticipation can lead to inaction, even when conscience compels otherwise. Later, when investigators would reconstruct the timeline, his role would be central. They would ask questions about what he knew, when he knew it, and why he chose an action. The answers would reveal patterns not of negligence, but of human complexity. Fear, uncertainty, loyalty, ambivalence, and love, intertwined in ways that are often difficult to untangle. For now, however, the night continued. Decisions were being made by default, as much as by choice. And every moment of silence, every missed signal, Every assumption that someone else would intervene compounded the tragedy that was slowly becoming unavoidable. The child who stayed behind was both participant and witness. That duality, so familiar to him throughout life, became a defining feature of this event. It created a tension that would reverberate for years, through family, media, and personal conscience. And in that tension lies the unsettling truth. Sometimes the people closest to a disaster are the ones least able to stop it. As dawn approached, the stage was set for the consequences of silence, proximity, and inaction to converge. The child who stayed behind would find himself at the center of scrutiny, not because of intent, but because of presence. Not because of direct action, but because of choices withheld. Not because of a loud misstep, but because of quiet hesitation. And once the unfolding events reached their peak, everyone, including him, would confront the question that is impossible to answer without hindsight. When the person you love reaches out, and you are close enough to intervene, what stops you from answering? But what came next would illuminate the devastating intersection of proximity and distance, and reveal consequences no one expected. At 11:47 p.m., the phone rang. It wasn't a long call. It wasn't filled with speeches or dramatic confessions. It was simple, ordinary. Except in hindsight, it wasn't ordinary at all. One ring, one attempt at connection, one fleeting chance. That single moment would later be dissected, replayed in memory, analyzed by investigators, and regretted by the daughter who never answered. It's hard to describe what that ring meant at the time. If you weren't in the house, if you weren't attuned to the undercurrents of this family, it probably seemed like just another phone call. Late, perhaps inconvenient, maybe even routine. But to him, it was urgent, desperate, a lifeline cast into an ocean of silence. We often imagine desperation in dramatic terms, shouting, screaming, running down a hallway. But real desperation is quieter. It's waiting, hoping, reaching out to the one person you think might answer. It's the sound of your own voice trembling just slightly, trying to hide fear with familiarity. He called his youngest daughter. The one who had always been the observer, the quiet presence, the one who watched more than she acted. She didn't answer. There were reasons. Perhaps she thought it was a wrong number. Perhaps she assumed he'd call again. Perhaps she thought he was upset, but not in danger. All of those are human rationalizations. They feel comfortable in the moment, until later, when you realize that comfort was an illusion. The unanswered call was brief, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. He didn't try again. Some people might argue that he could have, that anyone in his position would have tried a second or third time. But those who knew him understood that even a single unanswered attempt carried a particular sting. Pride, fear of intrusion, the uncertainty of how his plea would be received. All of that made the act of calling again emotionally complicated. There's something profoundly human about that hesitation. Even in the direst moments, we hesitate. We calculate. We rationalize. We tell ourselves there is always a second chance. And often, there isn't. Meanwhile, inside the house, life continued in ways that made tragedy almost invisible. Doors opened and closed. Clocks ticked. Lights dimmed. Movements that might have seemed mundane from the outside were carrying a quiet tension inside. The father, seasoned in directing scenes for audiences, now found himself in a scenario he could not stage or control. Here, there were no scripts. No actors following cues. Only raw emotion, fear, and isolation. The daughter who didn't answer the phone would later describe that moment as the most vivid in her mind, not because of anything she did, but because of what she didn't do. She said it haunts her in loops, daily reminders of a moment she assumed she could handle later, only to discover that later never came. This is what makes tragedy so cruel. It's not the dramatic acts themselves. It's the tiny moments. The missed cues, the hesitations, the unanswered calls, that compound and accumulate until they become irreversible. There was no one else in that house who could have intervened effectively. The other children were physically distant or emotionally disengaged. Friends or staff were outside the immediate timeline of crisis. Everything converged in that one space, one moment, and yet no immediate resolution occurred. And that is precisely what makes this night different from any ordinary night. The unanswered call is not just a missed connection. It is a pivot point, a fulcrum on which the entire story turns. It's the moment that separates possibility from inevitability. We like to believe that if someone calls and we ignore it, the consequences won't be catastrophic. We tell ourselves that warnings are usually overblown. We trust patterns over instincts. But sometimes the pattern misleads us, and one ring, one attempt at connection, is all the time we get. In the aftermath, investigators would try to reconstruct what the call meant. Did he sense danger? Did he fear for his life? Was it an emotional plea or a practical request? There are no definitive answers. The only thing known for certain is that it happened, and it went unanswered. And what makes it unbearable is that it could have changed everything. The night continued to unfold, quiet and measured, as if the house itself knew the magnitude of what had been missed. Sounds that might have alerted someone, steps, murmurs, movements, were either dismissed or overlooked. The guest house, where one child resided, remained physically close but emotionally distant, creating a paradox of proximity without influence. The father's situation escalated, unnoticed, in the spaces between rooms and hallways. Every minute that passed was a minute where intervention could have altered the outcome, and yet, the dynamics that had been in place for years. Distance, avoidance, miscommunication kept everyone from acting decisively. The daughter's eventual acknowledgement of the missed call was not just a confession of absence. It was a recognition of human limitation. It was a statement about how even those who love us most can fail to act, despite intentions, and that failure carries consequences heavier than any punishment or criticism. Time moved differently in that house that night. Seconds were stretched into eternity, small choices compounded into irreversible consequences, and one unanswered ring became the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. By the time dawn began to approach, the inevitability of tragedy was already taking shape. What had started as a single call, the faint echo of hope, would soon intersect with circumstances that no one inside the house could control. And that intersection would be where the story truly began. But what came next would reveal how years of avoidance, silence, and miscommunication had prepared the house and everyone in it for a night that no one could have predicted. There are moments in life that change everything with a single sentence. For Romy, it wasn't a speech, a confrontation, or even an argument. It was a call, one ring, and the knowledge, later confirmed, that her father had begged for help. Begged, not demanded, not instructed. Begged. It's a word heavy with vulnerability, with fear, with trust. It exposes the rawest form of human need. And hearing, or realizing, that someone you love, someone you've watched, admired, and sometimes feared, begged you for help is a weight no one is fully prepared to carry. Romy had lived in the shadows of her family's fame and fortune, careful to observe, careful to adapt. She had mastered discretion and restraint, understanding that actions, words, even thoughts had consequences in her world. But nothing prepared her for the weight of that word, begged. It wasn't just that her father had reached out. It was what it revealed about the man she thought she knew. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. He was human, fragile, desperate, and in need of her. Imagine being told, or realizing, that someone who had spent decades directing scenes, commanding rooms, shaping stories, had called you, alone, pleading for help. What goes through your mind? Guilt, panic, shock, regret, confusion. All of it, compressed into a single emotional moment that stretches across time. She remembers the sensation now, months later, still vividly. The ache of realizing she hadn't answered. The gnawing thought that she could have. That a single action, one phone call returned, might have shifted everything. It's easy to judge this from the outside. Why didn't she pick up? People might ask. But human psychology is rarely that simple. Distraction, misjudgment, disbelief, or even a momentary assumption that nothing was urgent can alter the course of events irrevocably. And yet, the knowledge that he reached out remains. It's etched into her memory like a scar. What makes this revelation even more profound is the context. She was not alone in the house. Other family members were nearby. Yet proximity didn't equal presence. Distance, emotional, psychological, relational, proved more impactful than walls or doors. In her statement, Romy described unimaginable pain, not only for the loss itself, but for what the moment represented, a fracture in trust, a missed opportunity, a gap between intention and action that could never be bridged. She speaks of it with trembling honesty, acknowledging that the word begged carries consequences far beyond its immediate meaning. And here's the nuance. Begging implies choice, yes, but it also implies limitation. Her father had tried other avenues. He had relied on relationships, systems, and assumptions that, in the end, were insufficient. The one person he believed might respond did not. This creates a tension that is almost unbearable, because love, even in its most idealized form, does not guarantee response. Proximity does not guarantee action. Knowledge does not guarantee intervention. And that tension is what haunts Romy most. She reflects on the irony, the tragedy, the cruel alignment of circumstance. A father reaching out at the precise moment when connection mattered most, a daughter within reach, and the world poised to shift irreversibly. There is also a profound lesson here about human nature. We like to think that action is instinctive in moments of crisis, that the people closest to us will respond immediately, that if someone we love calls, we will always answer. But real life is rarely that simple. We hesitate. We rationalize. We trust patterns over instincts. And sometimes, hesitation is all it takes to separate possibility from inevitability. In describing the moment, Romy doesn't embellish. She doesn't dramatize. She simply acknowledges the truth. He reached out. He pleaded. And she wasn't there. That truth reframes everything. Because the tragedy was not only the physical outcome, it was the emotional resonance. The knowledge that the person who had guided, protected, and loved her had relied on her in their final moments, and that reliance went unmet. It is a weight that shapes memory, guilt, and grief. It is a lens through which every past interaction can be reevaluated. Every unspoken conversation, every delayed response, every silent assumption. And that lens doesn't fade. It colors all future understanding. It sharpens the edges of loss, betrayal, and self-reproach. What she reveals also forces the audience to confront an uncomfortable question. What would you do if someone you loved begged for help, and you weren't there? What would you do if a single action could have prevented irreversible pain? These questions don't have easy answers. They live in the space between intention and outcome, between what is possible and what is chosen or deferred. As she publicly acknowledged, her father's plea was a crystallization of everything the family had avoided for years: confrontation, vulnerability, honesty. And it is a reminder that even the most powerful, successful, and respected individuals can be reduced to helplessness when isolation and silence dominate relationships. This is where tragedy and human behavior intersect, where longing and hesitation meet consequence, where a simple plea becomes a defining moment in a lifetime of narrative, reshaping perception, memory, and guilt. By revealing that her father begged for help, Romy does more than recount an event. She exposes the fragile architecture of trust, the thin line between action and inaction, and the catastrophic potential of moments left unheeded. It is a moment that reverberates through the story, linking the past with the unfolding events, setting the stage for revelations about patterns, decisions, and consequences that had been building for decades. And yet, even after acknowledging the call, the story does not end. Because an unanswered plea is not simply a lost opportunity. It is the spark that ignites questions, scrutiny, and a search for understanding that will consume everyone involved. But what came next would reveal patterns of warning, history, and consequences that no one could have predicted, and show just how far this tragedy had been seeded long before the night began. Sometimes tragedy is not sudden. Sometimes it's the product of patterns, repetitions, small signals overlooked until they coalesce into something irreversible. That's what Romy realized in the days following the night she would never forget. The phone call that went unanswered wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of subtle warnings, hints, and pleas that had gone unheeded. Families are complicated systems. They have dynamics that outsiders rarely grasp. And in families with wealth, influence, or fame, the complexity grows exponentially. A misstep isn't just personal, it has social ramifications. A conflict isn't private, it has public consequences. And in such environments, avoidance becomes a coping mechanism. Silence becomes a default response. Romy recalled instances from her childhood and early adulthood, moments that now, in hindsight, seemed glaringly obvious. Times when her father expressed frustration that went unaddressed. Times when tensions escalated quietly but dramatically. Moments when she or others chose convenience over confrontation. There was the time, years earlier, when her father had called in the middle of the night after a professional setback. His voice had been unsteady, almost pleading. But she dismissed it as stress, as part of the demands of his career. She had assumed he would reach out again if it were serious. He didn't. There were other moments too. Small requests that seemed minor at the time. A need for help with scheduling, emotional support, a conversation that was delayed or avoided. Each was brushed aside, minimized, or explained away. These patterns compounded, creating a culture in the family where reaching out became risky, or at least complicated. People often underestimate how small repeated signals can escalate into crisis. The body, the mind, and the emotional fabric of a family can all store these small disruptions until the cumulative effect is dramatic. And in this family, that buildup had been silent, almost imperceptible, until it could no longer be ignored. Consider the way patterns work. If someone repeatedly asks for help and is ignored, the threshold for future intervention rises. The more calls go unanswered, the more likely a person is to internalize the belief that their needs will not be met. And when the stakes become life-threatening, this pattern magnifies the consequences of inaction. For Romy, the weight of hindsight was crushing. She replayed decades of interactions, searching for moments she could have acted differently. Each memory carried its own sharp edge. A conversation ended too quickly, a subtle expression ignored, a message left unreturned. She understood that tragedy is rarely a single moment. It is a sequence of ignored warnings, each small in isolation, lethal in combination. The public narrative often focuses on the dramatic moment, the shocking event that draws headlines. But private reality is rarely so simple. Behind every tragedy lies a trail of indications, often invisible to those outside the family, sometimes ignored even by those within it. And it is precisely those ignored signs that Romy reflects on now, trying to reconcile grief with responsibility, love with guilt, memory with reality. Experts in human behavior would call this cumulative effect emotional momentum. Each ignored signal accelerates risk. Each dismissal strengthens patterns of avoidance. Each hesitation compounds vulnerability. In families where roles are rigid and communication is strained, the effect is magnified. By the time the crisis arrives, the family is operating on autopilot, and instinctive intervention is difficult or impossible. It wasn't just Romy. The entire family had adapted to patterns of avoidance and rationalization. They had internalized a belief that everything would resolve itself, that each member could handle their burdens independently, that crises would announce themselves clearly enough to demand attention. And that belief, tragically, was flawed. The warnings had been there. Subtle, scattered, easy to rationalize. But they were cumulative. They were ignored not out of malice, but out of habit, caution, and a misreading of urgency. As Romy reflected on these moments, the emotional complexity became undeniable. There was love, guilt, responsibility, and helplessness intertwined in ways impossible to untangle. The history of warnings ignored was not about blame. It was about understanding the forces that allowed tragedy to unfold. It was about recognizing the patterns that, if noticed earlier, might have changed everything. The father, seasoned in commanding his professional world, could not control these family dynamics. His authority, which had once seemed unshakable, was ineffective in the intimate, emotional domain. And the family, conditioned to avoid confrontation, had no framework for breaking the cycle. What's terrifying about these patterns is that they often seem benign until the critical moment. Each ignored plea feels inconsequential. Each small request dismissed seems manageable. Each subtle warning can be rationalized as normal human behavior. And then, suddenly, the accumulation becomes catastrophic. In the aftermath, Romy began to connect dots she had previously ignored. She recognized the significance of every small ignored plea, every subtle cry for attention, every hesitation that went unaddressed. The tragedy was not sudden. It was inevitable in the context of a family that had mastered avoidance and silence. And here lies the haunting truth. Warnings, no matter how subtle, are only useful if someone acts on them. Ignored warnings are invisible to everyone except memory. They linger silently until the night arrives when inaction has irreversible consequences. By the time the call came on that fateful night, the pattern was already in motion. Years of small ignored signals had primed the household for disaster. That unanswered call was the culmination of a history of warnings unheeded, a moment where avoidance intersected with desperation. And the lesson Romy would carry for the rest of her life was painfully clear. Tragedy is often the result not of a single catastrophic act, but of 1,000 small, overlooked moments. And in families, silence can be far more dangerous than conflict. But what came next would bring the physical reality of that pattern into sharp, undeniable focus. A reality that no one could ignore, a truth that would leave the entire family, and everyone watching, in shock. Morning came slowly, but the consequences of the night did not wait. When authorities finally arrived at the estate, they found something that would haunt them, the family, and eventually the world. A scene so violent, so absolute, that it seemed impossible to reconcile with the image of a life lived in control, comfort, and privilege. Rob Reiner and Michelle had been stabbed multiple times. The reports would later reveal numbers so extreme they defy comprehension. The father, who had once commanded rooms full of actors, producers, and cameras, had been reduced to vulnerability in the most brutal way imaginable. The mother, who had shared decades of partnership, shared the same fate. The space that had been a home, a fortress of affluence, designed for privacy and security, had been transformed into a crime scene. It's hard to convey what a space like that feels like when the familiar is violated. The walls, which once contained laughter, arguments, and the ordinary sounds of family life, now contained horror. The silence that had long been a feature of the house had become a weight, pressing on investigators, staff, and family members alike. The numbers themselves were staggering. Rob Reiner, stabbed over 100 times, according to his daughter's statements, was not merely killed. He had been overwhelmed, attacked, stripped of the very agency he had wielded his entire life. Michelle, equally victimized, lay alongside him, and the juxtaposition of love and violence struck everyone who entered the house. Yet what made the scene even more haunting was the absence of struggle elsewhere. The crime seemed contained, methodical in its own horrific way. Doors were closed, rooms untouched, the guest house remained intact. The violent act occurred in proximity to others who could have intervened, but did not. The physical closeness contrasts sharply with the emotional distance, amplifying the tragedy. Romy Reiner recalls her initial reaction to the news: disbelief, numbness, and a crushing sense of guilt. The unanswered call, the patterns of avoidance, the historical signs, all coalesced into a moment of personal reckoning. The realization that her father had begged for help and that she had not answered haunted her immediately, as if the past decades of family dynamics had led inexorably to that exact moment. There is a psychological phenomenon known as hindsight bias, where the past seems inevitable once the outcome is known. But for Romy, it wasn't merely hindsight, it was recognition. She could see the lines, the decisions, the silences that had stacked like bricks, creating the walls of this tragedy. And she could not escape the feeling that she had, in her own way, contributed to the conditions that allowed this night to happen. Investigators described the scene in procedural terms, noting the excessive violence, the pattern of wounds, the calculated nature of the attack. Yet beyond the technicalities, the emotional reality loomed large. This was a family, dissected in tragedy. A home, meant for safety, transformed into a stage of horror. And in that stark contrast, the human cost became undeniable. The world would later focus on the spectacle, the mansion, the money, the public profiles. But for Romy and anyone close, the scene represented more than headlines. It represented the culmination of years of fractured communication, avoidance, and misjudged priorities. It represented the ultimate failure of connection in a family that had mastered distance. Even as media coverage exploded, Romy's attention remained on one detail: the unanswered plea. That single moment, a phone call, was now intertwined with the scene itself, giving it a human, painfully intimate dimension that no report could fully capture. It was not just the violence, but the relational context that made the tragedy so incomprehensible. As authorities pieced together evidence, questions multiplied. Why did this happen? Who was present? What signals had been missed? What might have prevented it? The answers were both complex and terrifying. The tragedy was not the result of one moment or one decision, but the accumulation of many, of silence, proximity without engagement, and historical avoidance. And then there was the psychological layer no investigator could fully measure. The horror of realizing that someone you know and love has been violently attacked while the world continued elsewhere, while life moved on, and while calls went unanswered. The scene, brutal as it was, became a mirror for everyone connected to the family. A reflection of human fragility, the consequences of avoidance, and the thin line between routine and disaster. Yet even as the investigators cataloged evidence, interviewed witnesses, and began the procedural unraveling, Romy and the family confronted something more personal and raw. The recognition that no forensic detail, no narrative, could undo the fact that a father had begged for help, and the help had not arrived in time. This intersection of violence, missed opportunity, and human imperfection created a space that would define every public and private conversation thereafter. And in that space, one uncomfortable truth remained central. Proximity does not equal intervention. Closeness does not prevent tragedy. And love, even when present, is not always enough to change the course of events. By the time the day ended, the house had become a symbol of devastating contradiction. A space designed for protection and comfort, reduced to evidence of violence. A family meant to nurture one another, rendered fractured by inaction. A call for help, finally answered, not in life, but in memory and public confession. And as the day closed, one lingering question haunted every observer, every investigator, every loved one. What if someone had listened? What if the plea had not been ignored? What if patterns had been disrupted before they became inevitable? But what came next would bring clarity to the unseen forces that had been building for years. The motivations, the conflicts, and the subtle tensions that made this impossible night not just possible, but tragically inevitable. The moment the authorities stepped onto the estate, the atmosphere shifted. What had once been a home, albeit a tense and distant one, was now a crime scene. Every hallway, every door, every room became a point of inquiry. Investigators moved with methodical precision, their eyes scanning for anomalies, their minds piecing together the fragments of a night that had already rewritten a family's history. This was not an ordinary case. It involved high-profile individuals, immense wealth, and a family whose every move had been under public scrutiny for decades. That scrutiny added layers of complexity, amplifying the pressure on the investigators. Public curiosity met private grief, creating a storm in which every detail, small or large, was magnified. The guest house, home to the son who remained on the property, immediately became a focal point. Its proximity to the main house suggested opportunity, and opportunity often becomes the first line of inquiry in homicide investigations. Investigators questioned timelines, movements, and interactions. They examined access points, footprints, digital communications, and alibis. Every minute mattered. Every discrepancy drew attention. Investigators also considered psychological dynamics. They knew that domestic homicides rarely occur in isolation from emotional histories. They reviewed the family structure, patterns of communication, and history of conflict. What had outsiders perceived as privacy or independence could, in reality, conceal deep fractures. And in high-stakes households like this one, where appearances are meticulously maintained, those fractures often remain invisible until catastrophe strikes. Rob Reiner's statements became central to understanding the human context behind the crime. Her revelation about her father begging for help was more than testimony. It was a lens through which investigators could interpret the emotional landscape of the family. It provided insight into tension points, potential motives, and the psychological pressures leading up to the night in question. One of the first discoveries was that the violence was concentrated yet overwhelming in scale. The over 100 stab wounds to Rob Reiner signaled rage, precision, and something more than a spontaneous act. Investigators noted that such intensity often correlates with personal knowledge of the victims. It suggested access, familiarity, and possibly an emotional motivation that extended beyond the act of killing itself. Evidence from the main house indicated that no forced entry had occurred. This eliminated many theories about intruders, redirecting attention to those already within the household's orbit. Proximity, presence, and opportunity became intertwined with questions of intent and premeditation. Who had been near enough to act? Who could have intervened? And perhaps most chillingly, why had no one recognized the urgency until it was too late? For the family, the investigation was an ordeal in itself. Each member was scrutinized, questioned, and forced to confront private histories in public view. Rumors circulated. Media narratives collided with personal grief.